Designing for narrative influence studies the way speculative storymaking can be applied to social issues that require wide adherence for the sake of public good. Issues like mask wearing for public health and reducing resource usage for mitigating climate change. I am Ray L.C., Assistant Professor of Creative Media at City University of Hong Kong, working with Daijiro Mizuno of Kyoto Design Lab. Explicit policy measures often fail to elicit the appropriate responses due to the lack of intrinsic motivation. For example, compliance with wearing of face masks in this example from transportation in Ghana did not change despite government public health guidelines. Instead, we need an implicit way of affecting behavioral change for social good. We first set out to design stories for the purpose of informing media consumers the idea that recklessness leads to heartache. In the story, Jason misses the chance of a lifetime to go to Mars for a mission because he violates the quarantine bubble in order to see his fiancée. However, he later learns that his mission was to study the effect of a virus on non-Earth gravity, and when given another chance to go on a rescue mission, he decides to reduce risky behavior and succeeds in going on the mission despite his wife's pregnancy. He has now acted for the good of the mission by not breaking the quarantine bubble. To situate storytelling for influence in the context of today's social media communication, we use the machine learning-based natural language model GPT-2 pre-trained to Twitter feeds, private messages, YouTube captions, and novels in order to produce short flash fiction designed to affect public health behavior. These different media produce different levels of influence that implicitly tell the consumer to stay socially distant and wear masks without explicit instruction that will in turn provoke negative reaction and lack of compliance. In order to study how designers may work with stories in designing for social purpose, such as climate change, civic responsibility, and public safety, we held a series of workshops that allow attendees to collaboratively craft a story together for social purpose. We first introduced the different story archetypes from Christopher Booker and then gave each group a particular purpose to design for, such as collective restraint and future consideration. We then allowed the designers to think of their own story without telling the others and let one writer at a time to craft a story in a pass the baton fashion. Hence, the collective story is negotiated amongst writers in terms of themes and characters until they come together to craft an ending. This reflects the way stories in the real world are told in a collaborative fashion, passing between people. Here's an example of the completed story presented by one of the participants.
Design a story that encourages generations to reduce fossil fuel use, to reduce climate change by emphasizing collective restraint and future consideration. And the story goes with the luxury cruise ship departing for Antarctica. The survivors studied out whether the food should be distributed equally or whether food should be distributed according to their societal values. And then the team has kind of split into two and continue discussing things. But after all, they got rescued. And the section 4 ending is a bit sort of work in progress, but generally speaking, the protagonist has revisited his ways of life, his ways of thinking, and he kind of made a sort of behavioral change, and he decided to go out for another cruise as a unified group. The end. So I think it's really about the voyage sort of stereotype in terms of narrative structure. And what we can learn from this, I think, is the how we can design a narrative for behavioral change.
We found that despite everyone starting out with a evenly distributed number of intended structures, the final negotiated story fell into particular camps such as overcoming the monster and rebirth, indicating that these structures may be particularly useful for purposes like combating plastics and recognizing climate change. The arrows here indicate the evolution of a single individual's intended story structure to start and the final scored structure of the group outcome. We also found that people overestimated their own effect on the group design process, showing a perception of having accomplished the group-specific purpose more than the individual purpose. Applying narrative design techniques in a collaborative manner and using machine-generated snippets provides a way to implicitly influence people for public issues that require voluntary intrinsic adherence. Thank you for your attention.